It wasn't the house itself that held the secrets. Not really, it was the dust. The fine, pale dust of the California desert that settles like a shroud on things left behind. In what became known as Robert Mitchum's last retreat, this dust coated everything. It traced the rim of a forgotten drinking glass by the sink, softened the edges of a paperback novel left on a nightstand, its pages warped by the unrelenting dry heat. For years after he was gone, the place sat in a kind of suspended animation, a silent monument not to a movie star, but to the man who spent a lifetime trying to escape the very image he had perfected on screen. Most people remember the myth of Robert Mitchum. They remember the heavy-lidded eyes, portals to a soul that held both simmering menace and an unshakable bone-deep weariness. They remember the barrel chest, the laconic, dismissive drawl, the man who practically invented the modern anti-hero. He was the ghost in a trench coat, the face of film noir, forever walking down a rain-slicked studio street into a fog of moral ambiguity. But the homes he chose, the real bricks and mortar of his life, tell a different, far more complex story. They are an autobiography written in wood, stone, and isolation. They speak not of the characters he played, but of the man he was. A man desperately, and at times angrily, seeking a quiet corner in a world that demanded he be loud. This isn't a story about Hollywood glamour or architectural trends. It's a story about the search for a place to finally, truly exhale. Before the fame, there was flight. To understand the homes Robert Mitchum built, you first have to understand the rootlessness that defined him. His early life wasn't a prelude to stardom. It was a brutal Dickensian blueprint for an escape artist. Born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, his world fractured when he was just a toddler. His father, a railroad worker, was crushed and killed in a rail yard accident, leaving a void that would echo throughout Mitchum's life. He became a human pinball, bounced between his mother, his grandparents, and other relatives. He was a boy with too much energy, too much intelligence, and not enough structure to contain it. He was restless, a powder keg of poetry and pugilism. By the time he was a young teenager, in the depths of the Great Depression, he embraced the life of a vagabond. He rode the rails, crisscrossing the country, sleeping in hobo jungles, taking whatever work he could find, ditch digger, stevedore, professional boxer. This wasn't a romantic adventure. It was a lesson in survival. He saw the raw, unvarnished, often cruel underside of America long before he ever reenacted it on a sound stage. In Savannah, Georgia, at age 14, he was arrested for vagrancy and put on a chain gang. The experience was scarring. He saw men beaten, spiritless, and trapped. He escaped, and that act of escape became a defining characteristic. This formative trauma instilled in him a profound, lifelong distrust of authority and a fierce, almost obsessive need for self-sufficiency. He learned that the only person he could truly rely on was himself. So when Hollywood finally caught him in its glittering net in the early 1940s, he treated it with a cynical disdain that was completely genuine. He saw the artifice, the pretense, the men in suits who tried to control him, and they reminded him of every other authority figure he'd ever defied. He famously referred to acting as wiggling your ears. But the work, as much as he belittled it, offered a paycheck. And that paycheck was his ticket, not to more glamour, but to something he'd never really had. An anchor, a patch of ground where no one could tell him what to do. He wasn't buying status symbols. He was building fortifications. His first significant fortification was a 2-acre estate in Mandeville Canyon, purchased in the mid-1940s, as his star began its rapid ascent. The choice of location was telling. This wasn't the manicured show-off glamour of Beverly Hills or Bel Air. Mandeville Canyon was, and still is, a more discreet, rustic enclave nestled in the hills of Los Angeles. It was a place for people who wanted the convenience of the city, but the soul of the country, where horse trails were as common as paved roads. For Mitchum, it was perfect. Here, in this sprawling yet unassuming home, the first great paradox of his life took root and blossomed. While the world was falling for the dangerous, solitary figure on screen, the quintessential loner, Mitchum himself was a devoted, almost fiercely protective family man. He had married his teenage sweetheart, Dorothy Spence, in 1940. She was his rock, the calm center of his chaotic universe. Their bond would, astonishingly, weather every imaginable storm, infidelity, alcoholism, public scandal, for the next 57 years. The Mandeville Canyon house was their fortress, built to shield their children, Jim and Chris, from the very industry that was making their father a household name. The house itself was a reflection of this defiant normalcy. Architecturally, it was likely a classic California ranch-style home, low-slung and sprawling, designed to connect with the outdoors. It wasn't a vertical statement of ego, but a horizontal embrace of the land. Inside, there was no celebrity interior designer imposing a sterile, fashionable vision. The home was decorated by life. Friends recalled a place filled with books, not just novels, but thick volumes of history, philosophy, and poetry. Mitchum was a voracious, self-educated intellectual, a fact he took great pains to hide behind his tough guy image. The living room was dominated by a large, comfortable sofa and sturdy armchairs, all oriented around a fireplace that was clearly used. The kitchen was Dorothy's domain, a functional warm space that smelled of baking bread and roasting chicken, not a caterer's showroom. His sons would later recall a childhood that felt surprisingly normal, with a father who, when not on set, was present, engaged, and decidedly unstar-like. He would tinker with cars in the garage, a space that smelled of oil and metal, or disappear into his study for hours, a sanctuary filled with the quiet scratch of a pen on paper. Few knew he was a gifted writer and poet, even composing a full-blown oratorio that was once performed at the Hollywood Bowl. This house was where the secret Mitchum, the sensitive, creative man, could breathe. But few visitors noticed the subtle details of the fortification. The doors were solid, heavy wood, the locks were robust, the property was walled, screened by a thick curtain of trees and shrubs. It was a home designed for love, but also for defense, a place to keep the world, with its prying eyes and insatiable demands, firmly on the other side of the gate. Then came the storm that would breach the walls and prove that no fortress was truly impregnable. On a hot August night in 1948, the carefully constructed private world of Mandeville Canyon came crashing down. In a move many believed was a setup, police raided a small party at a rented house in nearby Laurel Canyon. Robert Mitchum, one of Hollywood's biggest and most bankable stars, was arrested for possession of marijuana. In the tightly laced moral fabric of post-war America, this was a cataclysmic scandal. It was career-ending. The studio, RKO, run by the eccentric Howard Hughes, braced for total ruin. The press descended like a pack of wolves, surrounding the Mandeville Canyon home, their cameras aimed like rifles at the front gate. The sanctuary had been violated. Mitchum's reaction became the stuff of legend. It was pure, unadulterated, weaponized nonchalance. When reporters swarmed him, shouting questions about his future, he just shrugged his shoulders with that signature weariness and delivered a line that defined his relationship with fame forever. Well, this is the bitter end of my career. I'm ruined. Later, when asked about his time in jail, he famously quipped, "It's like Palm Springs, but without the riffraff." He refused to play the role of the penitent celebrity. He served his 43 days at a prison farm in Castaic, working in the concrete block factory alongside other inmates, never complaining, never asking for special treatment. And a strange thing happened. The public didn't just forgive him. They loved him even more for it. He had faced down the system and emerged with his cool intact. The scandal hadn't destroyed his career. It had galvanized it, cementing his persona as the ultimate outsider, the rebel who could not and would not be tamed. But the experience left a deep and permanent mark. The public humiliation, the feeling of being trapped and displayed, it triggered the old trauma from the chain gang. More than anything, the invasion of his family's privacy was unforgivable. The Mandeville Canyon house, once a haven, now felt exposed, tainted. The world had found him there. It was time to execute a new, more profound escape. It was time to find a place so vast and remote that the world couldn't follow. Mitchum's search for true solitude led him east of Santa Barbara to a sprawling 640-acre ranch near the small town of Solvang. This wasn't just buying a bigger house, it was acquiring a different state of being, a full square mile. He had purchased a piece of the wild, a vast expanse of rolling hills, ancient oak groves, and seasonal creeks that offered not just privacy, but near total anonymity. This was his escape hatch, his personal kingdom. Here, on this immense canvas, Mitchum shed the skin of Robert Mitchum, movie star, the moment he passed through the gates. On the ranch, he was just Bob, a man who found more truth in the soil than on a script page. He built a simple, sturdy ranch house. It was not a mansion. It was a home, designed for function over form, built from wood and stone that seemed to rise organically from the landscape. It was a place for his horses, his dogs, and most importantly, his thoughts. The architecture of his life was now a study in radical contrasts. The claustrophobic film sets, the glaring spotlights, the endless glad handing of Los Angeles, that was his work, a performance he endured for the paycheck. The wide open vistas, the tangible silence, and the profound darkness of the ranch at night, that was his life. The ranch house was his headquarters. Its great room was anchored by a massive stone fireplace, its hearth blackened from years of use. The furniture was leather and wood, worn and comfortable, bearing the marks of life, not the polish of a showroom. His daily rituals here were a form of therapy. He'd rise before dawn, the sky still a deep indigo, and drink his coffee while watching the light creep over the hills. He worked the land himself, mending fences, clearing brush, performing the hard, physical labor that connected him to his own body and to the earth. He was an expert horseman, and he would ride for hours, often with his dogs running alongside, disappearing into the canyons of his property without seeing another soul. This was where the central conflict of his soul played out. In Hollywood, he was paid to be cynical and detached. At the ranch, he was deeply spiritually connected to the land, to his animals, to the primal rhythms of nature. Visitors to the ranch were rare and carefully chosen. Those who did make the pilgrimage spoke of a different Mitchum. The laconic wit was still there, a permanent part of his armor, but it was softer, less guarded. Here, he would hold court not as a star, but as a raconteur and self-made scholar. He would pour a stiff drink, lean back in his chair, and recite long passages of Keats, Shelley, or Shakespeare from memory. He'd engage in deep, probing conversations about history, politics, and the human condition. The ranch was his library, his monastery, his saloon, and his sanctuary. It was the only place where the deafening noise of the world, the constant hum of gossip, scandal, fame, and his own inner demons finally faded away. As the years wore on and the physical demands of the ranch became more challenging, Another kind of landscape called to him the sea. He eventually settled in a coastal home, a more manageable but equally private retreat in the exclusive community of Montecito. If the ranch was about possessing the earth and finding solitude, the beach house was about surrendering to a greater force and finding perspective. It was a place to watch the eternal drama of the tides, to feel the immensity of the Pacific Ocean, and perhaps to contemplate the vastness of his own improbable journey. Here, the comparison between his properties becomes a clear map of his psyche. The Mandeville house was the fortress, built to protect his young family from the outside world. The Santa Barbara ranch was his kingdom, a world built for himself to escape the man he was paid to be. And the coastal home? That was his monastery, a philosophical retreat for his final act. Architecturally, this later home was likely different again. Less rustic than the ranch, perhaps a more modern design with large expanses of glass that erased the boundary between the living space and the staggering view. The ocean became the primary work of art, its moods ever changing. The interior design, however, would have retained the essential Mitchum character: function over flash, comfort over concept. The focus would have been an armchair positioned perfectly to watch the sunset, shelves still heavy with books, and spaces designed for quiet contemplation, not grand entertaining. These homes, in their totality, reveal a man utterly uninterested in the trappings of wealth for their own sake. The luxury he craved wasn't in gilded faucets or marble floors. It was in the quality of the silence, the purity of the view, and the freedom to be himself. His spaces were profoundly masculine, but it was the masculinity of a poet woodsman, not a playboy. His closets weren't shrines to fashion. They were filled with worn-in jeans, comfortable chambray shirts, and sturdy boots. These homes were tools for living an authentic life, not stages for performing a famous one. This authenticity ran deep. Few people know the story of Mitchum and his lapidary workshop. Tucked away at his home, he had a setup for cutting and polishing stones. It's a hobby that requires immense patience, a delicate touch, and a quiet meditative focus. Everything his public image was not. The tough guy of the silver screen, the man who settled disputes with his fists, spent his private hours hunched over a grinding wheel, taking a rough, raw piece of stone and slowly revealing the delicate, beautiful pattern hidden within. It is perhaps the most perfect metaphor for his entire life. A man of hidden depths and surprising gentleness, forever trying to shape his own refuge from a coarse and demanding world. In his final years, especially after his beloved Dorothy passed away in the spring of 1997, a vital light in him seemed to dim. The anchor of his life was gone. He retreated ever further into the quiet of his Montecito home. When he died a few months later from lung cancer and emphysema, the house remained for a time untouched. It became a whispered legend among a few urban explorers and photographers who called it Robert Mitchum's deserted home. The images they captured are profoundly moving, not because they are spooky or derelict, but because they are so deeply, achingly human. A bookshelf still lined with his companions, William Butler Yeats, Dylan Thomas, T.S. Eliot. A simple wooden desk with papers scattered, as if he'd just gotten up to pour another drink. An old, overstuffed armchair positioned perfectly to catch the last rays of the afternoon sun, its fabric worn smooth from countless hours of use. It felt less like an abandoned house and more like a space holding its breath, waiting for its owner to return. This final quiet space reveals the ultimate truth of his journey. For all the storms he weathered and created, the infamous marijuana bust, the rumored affairs, the lifelong tumultuous battle with alcohol, what he truly craved was peace. He curated his life with a singular purpose: to carve out pockets of profound stillness. He was a man who saw the hollow emptiness at the center of fame and did everything in his power to fill it with things that were real. The 57-year love for his wife, the loyalty of his dogs, the tactile pleasure of working the land, the feel of the sun on his face, and the sacred silence of a room filled with books. His homes were never monuments to his ego. They were bunkers, each one designed to withstand the relentless siege of celebrity. From the defiant normalcy of Mandeville Canyon to the rugged isolation of the Santa Barbara Ranch, and finally to the contemplative quiet of his last coastal retreat, Robert Mitchum wasn't just building houses. He was building a defense, a lifelong, carefully constructed defense for the thoughtful, vulnerable, and surprisingly gentle man who lived behind those famously tired eyes. The greatest, most exhausting role he ever played wasn't the cynical detective or the heartless villain. It was the role of Robert Mitchum, and his homes were the only place he ever allowed himself to take off the costume and hang it up for the night. The dust that finally settled in that last house wasn't a sign of decay. It was a blanket of peace, a quiet, final testament to a wanderer who had finally, after a long and turbulent journey, found his way home.